sugar.
X-Men 97 episode 5, I Am Not Okay. Now, it's always usually the middle of the season that gives you all of the feels, and this is no different. Let's collectively catch our breaths and let's break this down piece by piece. Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to the grid. Okay, now we got to get into a lot of stuff, so let's not waste any time. Let's get right into it. Now, as the episode opens, as per usual, we hear a familiar voice from the X-Men, and this time it's Gambit.
Previously on X-Men.
Mr. Sinister, you are our son.
Which in context, after watching it now, has a lot of connections to it, because the title of this episode is also said by Gambit at the end, which, by the way, his voice is the second to last voice that we hear before we hear
I can't feel you.
which is also a callback to Wanda. And by the way, she is also a mutant. The recap continues as we get a glimpse or a hint that we might see Madeline again, along with Nathan Summers. Further into the recap, Magneto's monologue gives us a good indication that we're going to see the mutants actually come to a fair understanding of how to live inside of this world, specifically on their own terms.
And it does not ask you to love or embrace my kind as your own, but merely to accept that this is a shared world and that my kind have the right to live in it.
Which we do find out early in the episode will come because of the Genosha UN contract or agreement that is going to happen in this episode. But at the same time, it also feels hard to believe that it's actually going to happen this soon. Then, as we roll the intro, we see Cable, aka Nathan Summers, and Apocalypse, a further telling sign that Cable is coming sooner than later, and that might not be a very good thing. But this is also at the same time the first time that we've seen Apocalypse in this series, albeit in the intro, but it's the first time. And for me, I'm a big fan of how they transition from Cable to Jean, which feels like a way of telling the audience, us, if you didn't already know, that they have a connection in this episode somehow, even though it's specifically more than likely going to happen with Madeline. But the way that they transition from him to her makes it seem like there's something that's going to happen with all three of them at the same time. Then Storm looks like she's going to come back, and when she does, it's going to be with her full head of hair. But it doesn't happen in this episode, but she's coming back soon. And that would be amazing. If you know, you know, and I'm just going to leave it at that and keep going. Also, they show Gambit and Rogue in their classic kissing of each other again inside of this episode, which we've seen before, which for me was another telling sign that this episode is going to be heavily involving them and the love triangle that is with Magneto as well. So this entire thing obviously centers around them. We also see Gambit again back to back with Nightcrawler, aka Kurt Wagner, and we see them fighting in an earlier form of Genosha, which we also saw in the last episode. Then after the intro, as the episode opens, we hear and see a news reporter from the FC News. Her name is Trish Tilby.
Was it caused by atomic testing? Or is it nature herself deciding the time has come to change the human race?
Now, on the outside looking in, she might look like a completely throwaway character, but she's not, because she actually appears in comics for the first time in 1986's X Factor #7, and her full name is Patricia Tilby. Now that might not ring any bells to some, but I got you, because she goes on to be included inside of a bunch of different issues, including X Factor 7, 8, 9, and 10, then in X-Men Prime #1, and also in Uncanny X-Men 350. Her love interest in her appearances is none other than Beast, which takes a bunch of different twists and turns inside of the comics because of human mutant relations, as is everything inside of these comics. But her relationship is really tainted because of her job, because she has to tell the truth about what she's reporting on, but she's also conflicted because of what she feels for Beast, which at one point inside of the comics actually really clouds her judgment in terms of what she reports on. But also, the FC news may be a play on the relationship that Marvel has with EA Sports, because the popular FIFA game, which is now called FC because EA didn't want to pay for the license of $300 million again to FIFA, so they just changed the name. But the game mode in question here is called Ultimate Team Hero, which the illustrations for this mode are created by Marvel artist J.L. Giles, who also did wonderful work on the Ragnarok Prelude number 3 and 4. And as the news report continues, the first image that we see are those two. And Beast is putting on the charm heavy. And you know Beast is actually feeling himself when he actually puts on a suit and comes out in public. And look at her, just eating it all up. And my boy came in with the Riz like nobody's business. And when she returns the favor, look at him.
Well, I am just as flattered to be sitting with a renowned scientist such as yourself, Dr. McCoy.
Blue blushes too, my...
Go off, Beast. Yeah, my boy, go off. But then after that, we see again the original 5 X-Men that we saw in the first episode, which is also again a callback to X-Men number 1. Then further into the piece, Jubilee, in all of her Jubilee stuff, speaks about how hands-on the lessons are at the mansion, which sounds like a reasonable situation and a reasonable situation for regular folks to learn from. However, that's until she starts mentioning big death machines and vampire dinosaurs.
You know, but with big death machines and vampire dinosaurs.
What? Somebody please get this woman some PR training, because she is putting her foot in her mouth right now for every mutant that is watching and any other regular person that is watching at the moment. Please, somebody tell her some things that she's supposed to say and not say. Now, this is back in the 90s, and the Oculus Rift and Apple headsets were not created back then. So what is this on his head? Now, my first thought is that it was a sleep mask or something like that, and then I took a closer look, because maybe this is a device that he is using to communicate on the astral plane to Maddie Pryor. Then in the montage that follows, it feels like, or looks like, Patricia and her team have been around the X-Men possibly since the first episode, but we just didn't see the TV crew, like, because they were kind of blending in like a reality show, which again, if that is the case, is another nod to the 90s because of MTV Real World. But the evidence that I'm taking this from is because of the footage that they have, which includes Roberto grabbing the hand of Jubilee for the first time, which happened in episode 3, Beast's findings regarding Storm and her accident or being shot in episode 2, and obviously the aftermath of Jean and Scott's relationship after uncovering that she was cloned, and that happened in episode 2 and followed through in episode 3. But the 3 that we do not see inside of this montage are Rogue, Gambit, and Magneto, who are actually flying the jet to Genosha as we speak. Notice that Gambit is in the back and Rogue and Magneto are sitting in pilot and co-pilot. Yeah. But this entire love triangle situation that is going on here is even more heightened when Gambit says,
"This is taking forever."
Which is then met with a jab back from Magneto when he tells him,
Gambit, please remember that should the new Blackbird suffer a malfunction, you are the only soul on board for whom gravity would most certainly be an issue.
bro, let that man live. As they pull up to Genosha, Gambit actually makes a good observation that they have made a lot of renovations. The first of which being that we actually see on screen are the statues of Magneto and Charles, which are standing in front of a large structure that for me looks like it was designed after a Mayan palace. And the music that's playing underneath this is actually giving a sense of a island oasis, or something that you would actually step off into a cruise ship or something like that and experience. But if you pay close attention, you will understand or hear that the rendition that we are currently, or the music that we are currently hearing, is an island type of rendition of Never in Doubt, which is the X-Men theme song. And that is then followed up with Magneto's M in the background, which is also next to a Malcolm X type of poster of Magneto, which says freedom. And then very subtly next to that are stoplights, showing that Genosha is a real city with its own governing situation. Then walking by this area are Glob Herman, Leech, who we actually see later on and earlier inside of the credit, as well as a host of other mutants. Then, as we follow the Green Bird through the city, there's a reference to both Rogue and Lady Deathstrike in the poster that says Sharp Beauty. The reference to Rogue comes from the hair, which is specifically the white stripe inside of the hair. And of course, the Lady Deathstrike reference comes by the length and the possible strength of the nails, because they are incredibly long. But this is also slightly a nod to the 90s, because a lot of women had those types of nails as well, or at least something similar. They also kind of have that now too. But in terms of movies or pop culture that this reminded me of, the first thing that came to my mind was Players Club. I know, but it did. Then to the right of that is a sign for Laservision Arcade, which is obviously a nod to Scott, aka Cyclops, and his beam. Then for me, it was very fitting that the bird would actually fly over the flying school sign. At this point, majority of the mutants that we've seen so far, including Magneto and Rogue, can fly. But if you didn't know this, Rogue actually has her power, or gets her powers to fly, after her encounter with Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel. Then as Leech gets his ice cream, to the right you can see a welcome sign to the X-Men, which for me symbolized that the people of Genosha have been waiting for them for a long time. Oh, and standing next to Glob is Pixie, aka Megan Gwyn. Megan Gwyn. We then see Lynn Lee, aka Nature Girl, after which we get a wide shot of Genosha Square. Yes, that's what I'm calling it at this point, because there's nothing else that they say that it actually is called. And we again get a bunch of references to Magneto, which tells me more that they are really going to look to him as the leader. Then we get a callback to Phase 4, which in this case is in the way that Genosha believes that Magneto was right, because some folks in the 616 Earth MCU also felt that Thanos was right. Then we get a chance to see even more mutants, which includes Lavanya LeBlanc. As the plane lands, the music that is playing here and the way that the characters are structured reminded me of the first few moments of Black Panther, the first one, as T'Challa and crew are landing inside of Wakanda, which is after T'Challa rescues Nakia. Now, this next exchange between Madeline Pryor, aka Maddie Jean, I just can't let that go, Rogue, Gambit, and Magneto, this is both heartwarming and slightly telling to the love triangle that has been brewing since the beginning of this series, because the love triangle plot thickens like nobody's business right here. Because from the looks of things, Gambit was a third wheel or a tag along to the vacation that Magneto had planned for Rogue. Okay, so now we need to pause for just a second, because I need to spend some time talking about a theory or fan theory that hit my feed a little bit ago, and now I can't leave it alone. But kudos and credit goes to my sister. If she's watching this, thank you, because this actually came from her. So Magneto mentions that he was surprised to get an invitation from Val Warner, specifically to the gala that is being thrown on Genosha. And later she is very interested in the relationship that happens between Rogue and Magneto. So I submit to you, could it be that she is Mystique? Because up until now, we haven't seen her in plain sight just yet. And obviously, adding more fuel to this fire, Mystique is the mother of Nightcrawler. And in the very next scene, we see him inside of this series for the very first time. So But in the conversation that is had between Gambit and Nightcrawler, they are specifically talking about the killer monks that Gambit and everyone in the X-Men crew and Nightcrawler actually encountered in the Alps. And this happened back in the Nightcrawler episode of the animated series, which the episode in question is where the town that Nightcrawler hails from actually wanted to cast him out because they believed that he was a demon. And this happened while the X-Men were on a sort of vacation that actually was cut short. But moving on, we're still in the 90s, and that is very evident because of the fact that these apples that Gambit is now looking at are $10, and he's like, bruh, they are really taxing right now, aren't they? And for me, yeah, they kind of are. But there's a reason for that, and specifically if you've never been to an island before, things on an island are a little bit more expensive because of how they actually get them. Specifically, if you were to, say, visit the Virgin Islands, groceries in some stores are expensive, and that happens because of the import tax that is levied on the actual goods, plus the actual time or manpower that it actually takes to get them from the mainland to the island. But in all of this, Gambit is really not having, or really not jiving well, I should say, with the fact that his adversary for Rogue's Heart is the MVP of Genosha. Would you actually blame him? Then back inside of the mansion with the reporter that features Scott for the first time, we hear Patricia mention a name that we haven't actually heard for quite some time, or possibly ever, inside of the animated series. And that is Marvel Girl, who, by the way, she is actually talking about Jean Grey. And that is actually placed in context when the camera pans to her as she's element bending or doing whatever she's going to do with the water at this point right now. But you might be wondering, where the heck did the name Marvel Girl come from and then go? Great question, glad you asked. But it's unclear to many fans, including myself, of the franchise why Marvel decided to go away from Marvel Girl. But the theory around that centers around the fact that Chris Claremont probably didn't or was not fond of the term girl in reference to a woman, and he pushed, or rather insisted, on a change after the Phoenix Saga. Then, after a brief conversation about what happened in episode 3, Jean remembers what Logan means to her and lays a kiss on him, even though it was slightly weird. But, and though we know that he probably enjoyed that, he plays it off like he's not supposed to. But also in this conversation, Logan mentions that his face, or his mug, has not changed for 100 years. And that sounds like a throwaway line until you uncover the fact that he actually is about 100 years old. And you might be wondering, if you don't know a whole lot about Logan and his powers, well, that's because he can heal really quickly. Basically, he heals like a baby, which allows him to always look in his prime even if he isn't. But that does not excuse him from aging entirely. So he does age, he just does it really slowly inside of his actual body. But in the memory moment, we see a rare occurrence of Scott without his ruby glasses, which to date is the only time that I remember him actually being able to take them off and his eyes not lighting up a room. Patricia pokes the bear and adds even more fuel to the fire of the love triangle that is brewing between Maddie Jean, and Scott when she asks Scott about his son.
Jean and I don't have any kids.
You don't?
No, the lie detector determined that was a lie.
Which is technically true, but technically not at the same time. And when he's caught up in his lie and fumbles the bag pretty harshly, Patricia calls him to the carpet on it, and then he flips proverbial tables when he says,
Because you're normal.
Excuse me?
I said because you're normal. We fight, risk our lives for you. Evil mutants, robots, crazy aliens. I lie because the truth is we're nothing like you. Thank God, because it's the only reason you people are still alive.
What do you mean, you people?
Okay, now let's fast forward back to Genosha, because the scene opens when we get back to Genosha with a familiar voice of Sebastian Shaw. And when I heard this voice, I had a feeling, or I kind of knew, that the next person that I was going to be encountering was Emma Frost. Woo, yes, Lord. But also inside of this clip, we see Banshee, aka Sean Cassidy, Maura McTaggart, aka Maura Kinross, who at this point serves as Chancellor to the Mutant Council, which Emma is not very happy about. And we also see Callisto, who, by the way, is the leader of the Morlock, and also appears in the first season, episode 5 as well. Then, after Magneto's monologue about everything that he remembers about the history of him and Charles, Madeline calls him Magnus. And if you've never heard him being called that name before, you might think that she was talking to somebody else, but she's not. Because Magneto has gone by a bunch of different names inside of the comics, but this one specifically that she's talking about, the full version is Eric Magnus Lynchier. Now, the fact that she says this name denotes that she has been, or he has been, around the X-Men for a very long time, and possibly even a friend even before this time that we're seeing on screen, which for me is also a nod slightly to the Foxverse when Magneto and Charles were actually friends at one point. Magneto then accepts his nomination as leader of Genosha on one condition, that his queen could be Rogue, which she's not very happy about, because she doesn't want her life to be puppeted by another person, and in this case specifically, a man. But this man, Magneto, has the riz of 1,000 kings.
I won't deny my passion for you. As with Gambit, loving you makes broken men whole, so that even as you deny us, our heartache is not in vain.
Man, what? Then as we cut back to the mansion, Madeline, yes, that is Madeline, asks Scott about a description and how he sees Nathan.
I see him everywhere. I can't see color, but up here, I see these big brown eyes and this wild rust-colored hair.
Which, by the way, becomes very, very, very paramount to remember as we get to the end of this episode, because it's the only real identification in terms of his eyes that we get as an identifying factor to Madeline about who he is, because obviously she hasn't seen him grow up. Then as Madeline and Scott kiss on the astral plane for the first time in this season, Jean steps in and wants an explanation on what the heck is going on.
What the hell is going on between the sheets in my home?
And then when we cut back to Genosha, where Madeline actually is, she blames it on a mind drift.
Sorry, mine just drifted a moment.
And Emma Frost calls her on her stuff because she pulls her card heavily right here when she says,
"Mind drift indeed."
And that tells me that Emma actually was able to see this inside of the astral plane as well. But you don't see her because there's possibility that she's cloaking herself as she's doing this. Now, the next line from Jean about her being summoned by all of the galaxies at this point, or at some point, I should say, and then she turned it all down for Scott, sounds a lot like
2 years ago, promises is all I heard.
But Nerf Scott shows up again when he tries to argue Jean and his point, because this man's point, and he could not be a lawyer because his arguing skills are weak, because the only comeback that he has is,
And you? You don't trust your memories. Do you even love me?
bruh, you gotta do better than that. Now, when Jean has her first encounter with what's later coming in the episode, this took me some time to actually uncover. But when I saw it, it was really hard to not see later on, because this is what she, or Madeline and Jean, both experience in the first episode on the astral plane, which is the deaths and many deaths of mutants.
No, not again.
And by the way, the Sentinel that we see at the end of this episode is called a Tri-Sentinel, and in the comics, that was created by Loki. So later, it got me thinking, later when Cable shows up and says he's coming, now could he possibly be talking about two people, Apocalypse and maybe Loki? Then the conversation that is had between Rogue and Gambit is really deep and heart-wrenching, to say the least. And it also uncovers more of what we've talked about in previous breakdowns, specifically being the fact that Rogue actually used to be evil, which you can actually see inside of Uncanny X-Men 186. It also uncovers that Magneto can read and possibly speak Hebrew, which, if I'm not mistaken, in the final moments of this episode, he actually does speak Hebrew to Leech. And it also speaks to the fact of why Gambit and Rogue never became a real item as it should have been, because of the agreement that happened between Rogue and Eric when she actually joined the X-Men, and that her and Magneto actually do in this series meet in a version of the Savage Land. And this is also the first time that we hear Rogue say, "You light up everything that you touch except for me," also explaining that his heart may beat for her, but she can't feel it because she can't touch him, which is also foreshadowing of what she says later on in the episode.
I can't feel you.
Then as the firework transition happens to the gala, we see in the stars the Watcher, which, if you're paying attention, is a early clue that realities are about to collide fast. And now, yet another round of Who's That Mutant? So first up, what looks like Angel, then Nightcrawler dancing to rave music, then there's Tirsias, and of course, Emma and Sebastian Shaw, which then leads to a conversation about Magneto becoming the leader of Genosha with his queen, Rogue. And yet again, this reminds Gambit of what he cannot do with Rogue, and that is touch her, which hits really, really hard later on. Then enter Rogue, and as she comes into the room, the song that is being played in the background is called Happy Nation by Ace of Base, which, by the way, came out in 1992, the same year of the first season of the animated series. The dress that Rogue is currently wearing right now is not by happenstance. It is actually her date dress inside of the comics. But the one thing I wanted to point out before the grand finale of this episode here is before Rogue actually kisses Magneto, she ponders about it a bit, and you can see that from the shiftiness in her eyes, almost as if she is reading the room to find out if everyone's looking at her and him at the same time, and then understands what her actions next would actually do to this room. Now, let's get to the deepest part of this episode, which, by the way, if you haven't figured out by now, this is Act 4, which is started when Madeline gets hit with the telepathic beam that Jean also had early on, which also made me think, was this happening at the same time in real time, just in different time zones? But as she experiences hers, Madeline actually hears Cable's voice, which says, "Shut the music off." Now, this struck me as odd, because usually when a telepathic person or a telepathic mutant experiences something to this dramatic effect in terms of actually having her nose bleed, they yell hysterically, which by and large would have probably stopped the music itself. But she doesn't do that. Instead, she just drunkenly stumbles onto the platform or the balcony that is inside of the building and encounters Cable, which, by the way, she calls him Cable and not Nathan, which tells me that until she sees his eyes, she has no idea that he is who he is to her. And for me, that specifically came as a huge clue when she says,
Oh, no, not again.
Eyes. You made it. You survived.
Now, I get that it could just be that Cable is a nickname, but as a baby, or at least from what we've established in this series so far, they never called him anything other than Nathan. And then chaos. As things start blowing up everywhere as Nightcrawler tries to save Magneto and Rogue, Rogue then tries to extend the favor back to him and tries to help him, realizing that she's not in her suit and that if she touches him, it will be worse off. We also then see members of the Inner Circle, which is AKA are also known as the Hellfire Club, that have now died. Now, when Val is trying to play traffic cop and instruct all of the mutants to the gardens, she is the only one in that vicinity of people that is not vaporized, even though she directly looks at the Tri-Sentinel in the eye and it does nothing to her. So that fuels the fire for me that if she is Mystique, she is really using her abilities to mask everything about her human or mutant genes and specifically looks very human to the Tri-Sentinel, because it says nothing about vaporizing or destroying her, even though she stops in her tracks. But even though Gambit doesn't make it out of this battle, they really did that man justice, and I have to applaud the writers and also everyone that is around the illustration of this series, because it was done flawlessly, even though it was tragic. But I really enjoyed the fact that they allowed this man to have full reign of his powers, rolling Sentinel heads like child's play. He even comes in riding on one of the Sentinel heads as if it were a horse.
Io Silver! Away!
And inside of this scene, one of the Morlocks actually says X-Men are not friends of Morlocks, but in this situation, a mutant is a mutant is a mutant, and anyone by any means necessary is going to get help. Now, I know that I've said some funny things about Magneto in the last breakdown about in terms of him getting his butt whooped, but this one was hard to watch, specifically knowing that he's not going to make it out of this battle. But I want to draw your attention to the hand wave that he does when he's trying to save Rogue and Gambit, because he doesn't break concentration at all on the Sentinel as he directs traffic or metal to Rogue and Gambit to save them from the blast that is coming. Then, after the apparent death of Eric, Rogue sees red and nothing else, charging straight to the Tri-Sentinel with pretty much reckless abandon, and Gambit charges his motorcycle to save her. But the final charge that he does to the Tri-Sentinel is a full circle moment, even in the very short amount of time that it happens, because he says moments earlier that if you charge at this thing, it is basically a death wish, and he does exactly the same thing. And when he does, he pays the ultimate price by charging the entire Tri-Sentinel and exploding it, which then leads us to the very final words of this episode, which again is a callback to Wanda when she encounters Vision for the first time in WandaVision, and those words infamously are, "I can't feel you," which in turn is even more heart-wrenching because she's actually touching him for the very first time and she doesn't feel anything. Okay, everybody still with me? Y'all good? Yeah, that was a lot. That was a lot to break down, but we got through it. But If you're now still on the nostalgia train and you want to keep going down that memory lane, go ahead and check out this video right up here, which is Iron Man, or a breakdown of Iron Man. And if you want to go through all of the breakdowns from episode 1 to episode 5 at this point, check out this playlist right up here. And until then, until next video, y'all be smooth. Blurred out.